Most people today picture medieval hermits as thin, lonely figures wrapped in rough wool, wandering from cave to cave with nothing but a wooden staff and a whispered prayer to guide them. It's an image shaped by paintings, manuscripts, and centuries of folklore, the holy recluse banished from the world, surviving on roots and faith, shivering through nights filled with icy wind. But that image, though poetic, is only a sliver of the truth. The real story is far more complex, far more human, and far more impressive. These hermits were not simply spiritual enthusiasts hiding from society. Many of them were hardened survivors who mastered the environment in ways that rival modern wilderness experts. They had to. The wilderness of medieval Europe was no peaceful retreat. In winter, it was an unforgiving battlefield where nature tested every living thing without mercy. Temperatures plunged, rivers froze solid, and storms rolled over mountains like great white monsters. Blizzards could last hours, sometimes days. Entire villages lost crops and livestock to the cold, and even well-equipped soldiers avoided unnecessary travel in deep winter. Yet somewhere out on the edge of civilization, far from the comfort of hearths and crowded halls, there lived individuals who faced the full brutality of those winters alone. No army, no family, no companions. Just themselves, their shelter, their faith, and their understanding of nature. Imagine for a moment the life of such a person. A hermit might wake before sunrise, the frost still clinging to his cloak, his breath forming pale clouds in the darkness of his dwelling. The stillness would be overwhelming. The forest, the mountain, the valley. Everything remained silent under the weight of winter. If the hermit lived in solitude long enough, he would come to sense the cold not as a single force, but as something layered, the crisp bite of early morning frost, the sharp sting of midday wind, the heavy, sinking chill of nightfall. Each demanded a different response, a different adjustment of habit or clothing. This knowledge, accumulated through years of observation, became a kind of survival wisdom no book ever recorded. We often forget that medieval hermits chose their isolation deliberately. They weren't banished, nor were they forced into exile. Most sought solitude as a path to spiritual depth or clarity, believing that silence brought them closer to the divine. Yet that pursuit came with very real physical challenges, especially during winter. To survive without the comforts of society, a hermit needed more than devotion. He needed resourcefulness, and over the centuries, these hermits developed remarkably effective strategies that turned raw nature into a partner rather than an enemy. The simple fact that they endured harsh winters again and again is evidence of how skilled they were at shaping their environment into something livable. When a blizzard approached, the signs were clear even before the first flakes fell. The wind would carry a low, distant hum, the voice of oncoming winter. Birds disappeared, the air became unnaturally still. Hermits learned to read these signs with precision, knowing that preparation was crucial. A moment of inattention could mean the difference between life and frostbitten death. Consider the mindset of someone living alone in such conditions. There's no warm tavern down the road, no neighbors to check in, no horses or wagons carrying firewood. When the storm arrives, whatever the hermit has is all he will have. That understanding creates a kind of discipline modern people rarely know. Every action becomes intentional. Gathering reeds, drying straw, reinforcing walls, finding cracks where wind might slip in. Even the simple task of arranging a sleeping area becomes a strategic act of survival. The medieval hermit, for all his reputation as a detached spiritual wanderer, was in reality a practical engineer of his own existence. He had to think ahead, sometimes days ahead, because a blizzard didn't care about meditation or prayer. Nature demanded respect, and the hermit gave it by mastering the environment through observation and adaptation. Surprisingly, many hermits lived in places modern people wouldn't even consider habitable. Mountain ledges, dense forests, marshlands, remote riverbanks, each location came with unique challenges. The higher elevations meant colder nights and stronger winds. Forest hermitages risked dampness and limited visibility during storms. Marsh areas froze unpredictably, creating dangerous patches of thin ice. Yet hermits chose these places not because they were easy, but because their harshness created isolation. Solitude wasn't simply desired, it was central to their way of life. And so the hermit made peace with these conditions by learning to use the land creatively. Sometimes he built a shelter using fallen branches, layering them with mud and foliage until the wind could no longer tear through. Other times he dug into the earth itself, creating a small hollow chamber that acted as a natural insulator. These dwellings were rarely spacious. Many were scarcely large enough for a person to sit or lie down. But size was not the point, warmth was. By limiting the amount of air inside, the hermit reduced heat loss, turning even the tiniest space into a refuge. To understand how impressive that is, we must imagine winter from the perspective of someone without modern fabric, without synthetic insulation, without thermal lining or fleece. All the hermit had was wool, straw, earth, and fire, when fire was even possible. Yet through trial, error, and the accumulated knowledge of generations, he learned how to bend these materials to his will. Most people today think of wool as old-fashioned, but in the Middle Ages, wool was the closest thing they had to advanced heat technology. A thick wool cloak could trap body heat with surprising efficiency, even when the fibers became damp from snow or cold breath. A hermit might use one cloak during the day and reserve another for sleeping, a second skin that guarded him from the night's cruelty. And when the blizzard winds howled across his dwelling, rattling branches and filling the world with white, the hermit wrapped himself tightly, slowing his breathing, conserving every ounce of warmth. The idea of sleeping warm in such conditions seems nearly impossible to someone unfamiliar with historical survival techniques, yet hermits did it night after night. Their ability to endure was not the result of luck or extraordinary constitution. It was the result of knowledge passed down informally, sometimes shared between hermits, sometimes self-taught. In solitude, they learned how their bodies reacted to cold, when to eat, when to fast, how much movement preserved warmth versus wasted it. They began to understand that warmth was not only created, it was protected. And protection required strategy, but beyond the physical, there was also a psychological dimension. Isolation can sharpen awareness in ways communal life cannot. A hermit knew every sound of the forest, every shifting pattern of wind, every creak of his dwelling. In this heightened state, he sensed danger early and acted quickly. Many hermits believed that surviving the cold was itself a spiritual discipline, a test of their endurance, their humility, and their connection to the natural world. Winter became not just a season but a teacher. Through hardship, they learned patience. Through silence, they learned clarity. Through cold, they learned resilience. These qualities fed into their survival as much as any physical technique. Imagine the evening before a blizzard, the sky heavy with gray clouds that threaten to collapse under their own weight. The hermit gathers the last of his water, secures the entrance to his dwelling, and adds a few final layers of insulation to his sleeping area. Every movement is calm, deliberate. There is no panic, only preparation. He has seen storms like this before. He knows what is coming. As the first flakes drift down, the world grows quieter. The storm swallows sound, light, and distance. Soon the snow falls in thick sheets, spinning through the air like white sparks. Inside the hermitage, darkness settles. The hermit wraps himself in wool, draws his knees close to his chest, and lets his breath ease into a slow rhythm. Outside, nature rages. Inside, he becomes stillness itself. That contrast, the wild storm and the calm hermit, is at the heart of why these individuals have fascinated historians for centuries. They represent a kind of strength that does not come from force or weapons, but from knowledge, patience, and discipline. They survived where many others would not because they understood one simple truth. Winter is not an enemy to be fought. It is a challenge to be outwitted. The hermit knew that nature always followed patterns. Cold came and went. Storms arrived and eventually passed. And if he could endure the worst nights, the dawn would always return. To modern eyes, this life seems impossible. No warm home, no thick mattress, no fire crackling in a stone hearth. But to the medieval hermit, survival was not extraordinary. It was routine. Every winter taught him something new. Every blizzard sharpened his senses. And every night he outlasted the cold strengthened his confidence and deepened his understanding of the world. Over years, he became a master of winter in ways most people today will never experience. His survival was not a miracle. It was a craft. And so the image of the fragile herm, it must be replaced by something far more accurate. A quiet, resilient figure who understood nature more intimately than the farmers in the valleys below, who moved with purpose through the harshest landscapes, who built warmth not with luxury, but with ingenuity, and who endured storms not out of stubbornness, but out of deep commitment to his chosen way of life. He was alone, yes, but never helpless, vulnerable, yes, but never unprepared. What we see as suffering, he saw as discipline. What we fear as freezing wilderness, he embraced as solitude. And so, night after night, year after year, he survived, sometimes in conditions that would defeat even well-equipped travelers. To understand how medieval hermits slept warm through blizzards, we must first understand who they really were. Not drifting wanderers, but deliberate survivors. Not victims of winter, but students of it. Individuals whose lives, though quiet and hidden, hold lessons in resilience that still speak to us today. Their world was cold, harsh, and lonely, but with wisdom, patience, and an almost unshakable inner strength, they endured the storms that reshaped the land around them. And in that endurance, they found both survival and purpose. When people today think of ancient or medieval shelter, their minds jump to wooden huts, stone houses, or drafty monasteries perched on rocky cliffs. But the hermits who sought solitude in the Middle Ages lived in a very different architectural reality. For them, the most reliable refuge in winter wasn't built above the earth, but carved directly into it. To understand how and why medieval hermits did this, we must start by reshaping our sense of what shelter meant to someone living entirely outside society, far from roads, farms, and the warmth of human habitation. The ground beneath our feet is not usually the first thing we think of when imagining warmth, but for hermits living in harsh climates, the earth itself was a natural heater, quiet, stable, and surprisingly generous. Medieval Europeans didn't have scientific thermometers or data charts, yet they understood through experience that the deeper one went into the ground, the more consistent the temperature became. This wasn't scientific theory, it was survival knowledge. Farmers felt it when digging storage pits for root vegetables, shepherds experienced it when caring for animals in dugout pens, travelers discovered it when taking refuge in caves, and hermits, living closest to the rhythm of nature, turned this lesson into an entire method of winter survival. A hermit entering solitude didn't simply wander into the wilderness and hope for the best. He observed, he learned, and then he chose a place that offered both silence and stability. Many of the earliest hermits across Europe, from Ireland to Italy, from France to the Byzantine world, intentionally settled near or inside natural cavities. These weren't chosen for comfort. They were chosen because the earth acted as a guardian. The temperature inside a cave or hollow remained far warmer than the icy storms outside, even on nights so cold that trees cracked and split from ice pressure. The interior of a small earth chamber would feel almost mild by comparison. But natural caves weren't always available, and even when they weren't always shaped in ways that made them safe or practical for daily living. So many hermits did what humans have done since the dawn of time. They shaped the environment with their hands. Using simple tools, a wooden spade, a stone pick, or in some cases just a sharp stick, they began carving spaces into hillsides, riverbanks, or soft stone outcroppings. These earth rooms, as we might call them today, were rarely large. Some were barely tall enough to sit up in. Others offered just enough space for a small sleeping area and a corner for storing whatever few belongings the hermit possessed. It is important to remember that these people did not think of themselves as architects. They thought of themselves as seekers of solitude. The compact size of these carved shelters was not a mistake, but a deliberate choice. A small space meant less air to heat, less exposure to wind, less risk of collapse, and less energy spent reinforcing the structure. For a hermit living alone, everything, from food gathering to firewood collection to spiritual discipline, required energy. Efficiency was survival. A tiny space, no larger than a modern walk-in closet, could become a winter fortress simply because of how effectively the hermit learned to manipulate the environment. Imagine the experience of digging such a shelter. First comes the search for the right location. The hermit would test the hillside, pressing the soil between his fingers, checking its firmness. Clay and compacted earth were ideal. Loose sand or waterlogged soil could collapse. If he found a patch of stone, he would look for softer layers, limestone or chalk, materials that could be carved with patience rather than brute strength. The work might take days, perhaps weeks. Each handful of soil removed was a step deeper into solitude. As the chamber took shape, the hermit would become intimately aware of the earth's texture, its scent, its temperature. In those moments, he wasn't just building a shelter. He was forming a quiet bond with the land itself. Inside these chambers, the world was transformed. The wind, so loud and brutal outside, became a muted whisper. Snowstorms no longer felt like threats but distant murmurs. The earth's insulation created a barrier between the hermit and the fierce cold of winter. It wasn't warmth in a modern sense. There was no cozy fireplace, no glowing lantern, but it was stability, and in the Middle Ages, stability was precious. A temperature of just a few degrees above freezing could mean the difference between life and death. The architecture of these earth rooms was also shaped by the hermit's spiritual life. Solitude required silence, and the earth provided that like no constructed building ever could. Stone and wood echo, earth absorbs sound. A hermit inside his carved chamber might hear only the soft beat of his own heart and the distant hum of the wind. This silence deepened his sense of separation from the world, allowing him to enter long periods of prayer or contemplation without interruption. For a hermit, survival and spirituality were not separate. They were intertwined. The earth room was both a shelter and a sanctuary. Let us imagine what it felt like during winter. Outside, the landscape might be blanketed in snow so deep that walking through it became a test of endurance. The branches of trees would bow under the weight of ice. Streams might freeze, turning dark water into silent mirrors. In such conditions, the hermit's carved shelter became more than a refuge. It became a womb of safety. Crawling inside, he would enter a space that felt almost timeless. The low ceiling meant heat from his body collected quickly, warming the small chamber. Straw or reeds might be laid on the floor to create a barrier from the cold earth. A small entrance, just large enough to squeeze through, reduced the amount of cold air rushing in. The space was not comfortable by modern standards, but it was profoundly protective. To understand the genius of this design, one must appreciate the natural properties of Earth. Soil and rock have enormous thermal mass. They store heat and release it slowly. Even in freezing conditions, the earth beneath just a few feet of surface stays surprisingly warm, sometimes around 10 degrees C, 50 degrees F, even when outside temperatures drop far below that. Hermits didn't need to know the exact numbers. They simply felt it. After spending a day exposed to open winds, stepping into a carved chamber felt like entering a different climate zone. Even if the chamber wasn't warm, it wasn't frozen. That alone could save a life. The hermit's decision to carve his shelter into the side of a hill or cliff also reflects an intuitive understanding of geography. Hillsides provided natural drainage, preventing rain and melting snow from pooling inside the shelter. Higher ground kept the hermit safe from flooding, a real danger in winter when unexpected thaws could send torrents of icy water rushing down valleys. Rock outcroppings offered natural protection against predators, from wolves to wandering bandits. The location of a hermitage was chosen with precision. Solitude was important, but safety was equally necessary. Because these earth rooms were so small, they were easy to maintain. If cracks formed, the hermit could pack them with clay or moss. If the entrance became blocked with snow, he could clear it with a stick. If wind threatened to blow into the chamber, he could drape animal skins or woven mats across the opening. Everything was done on a scale manageable by a single person. A hermit didn't have a community to rely on. He was his own builder, caretaker, and protector. The space he lived in reflected his capacity to survive with minimal tools and maximal ingenuity. Inside, the daily rhythm during winter was slow and contemplative. A hermit woke with the sunrise, though sunlight might only reach him indirectly, filtering through the narrow entrance and casting soft shadows across the curved walls. He would check the structure, ensure no moisture seeped in, adjust his bedding, and then begin whatever spiritual practices defined his life. For some, this meant hours of silent prayer. For others, reciting psalms or copying scripture by candlelight. But candles were expensive and required resources the hermit rarely had, so light was used sparingly. Darkness was not an inconvenience, it was a companion. The earth chamber encouraged introspection, forcing the hermit to turn inward, physically and spiritually. As the blizzard outside howled and sent white clouds sweeping across the landscape, the hermit remained anchored, cocooned inside his carved sanctuary. Snow could pile outside the entrance, forming a natural windbreak. In fact, snow itself, contrary to modern assumption, is an insulator. A thick accumulation of snow around the chamber helped trap heat inside. The hermit would sense the difference. Over time, he grew attuned to the subtle changes in temperature, the faint shifts in airflow, the delicate sounds of ice expanding or branches cracking. This intimate awareness of the natural world became a survival tool. The hermit didn't rely on external warnings to know when a storm was coming. He felt the change in pressure in his bones, sensed the moisture rising in the air, heard the shift in animal behavior outside. Nature spoke to him through a language of signs, and he learned to listen. The earth room was not merely a shelter from nature. It was part of nature, a place where the outside world flowed in subtly and continuously. If a modern person stepped into such a chamber, the silence might feel suffocating. The darkness might feel oppressive. The compact space might feel claustrophobic. But to the hermit, these were comforts. They meant protection. They meant he was hidden from the world, safe from danger, free from the noise of society. In winter, when blizzards could blind even the most seasoned traveler, the hermit's simplicity became his strength. He didn't need to escape the storm, he only needed to wait, sheltered by the earth itself. Over generations, hermits refined these techniques. Some carved small niches into the walls to store dried food or water containers. Others smoothed the floor with stones, making it easier to place bedding materials. Some added narrow vents near the top of the chamber to allow smoke or breath moisture to escape without letting in cold drafts. These vents were tiny, often no larger than a fist, but they demonstrated an understanding of airflow that modern survivalists would applaud. The earth room, in its simplicity, represented a mastery of minimalism. With no architectural flourishes, no decorative carvings, no unnecessary expansions, it embodied pure function. Everything had a purpose: to preserve heat, to resist wind, to remain stable, and to allow the hermit to survive with the least amount of energy expenditure. In a world where every breath and every calorie mattered, this efficiency was vital. Over time, these carved shelters became part of the landscape's memory. Some still exist today in remote parts of Europe's small hollows in cliffs or gentle slopes that bear the faint marks of human hands. Archaeologists sometimes stumble upon them and marvel at their simplicity. Locals may know them as old hiding places or monks' caves, but few realize just how essential they were to the people who once depended on them. Inside such a shelter, a hermit might sit through the night listening to the blizzard outside, wrapped in wool, his breath warm against his cloak. The storm might rage for hours, battering the land, but the hermit remained untouched. The earth around him absorbed the shock of the wind, muffled the roar, and held its own quiet warmth. It was not comfort as we know it, but it was endurance, and endurance was everything. The deeper meaning of these shelters goes beyond mere survival. They reflect the hermit's world, a belief that simplicity leads to clarity, that nature is both a challenge and a teacher, and that solitude is not emptiness but fullness. To carve a dwelling into the earth is to return to origins, to reside inside the very thing that sustains life. For the hermit, the earth was not just ground, it was protection, stability, and connection. In winter, when the world outside turned white and the sky disappeared into swirling snow, the hermit's earth room remained constant. The storms might test his patience, his body, his faith, but the shelter held. It reminded him of something fundamental. Survival doesn't always require strength. It often requires knowledge, humility, and the willingness to adapt. And so, night after night, year after year, medieval hermits slept through blizzards, not with fires blazing or thick blankets piled high, but with the quiet, steady warmth of the earth embracing them. The walls around them were not built by craftsmen or masons, but shaped by their own hands, guided by instinct and necessity. In those small, silent chambers carved into hillsides and cliffs, solitude and survival coexisted in a delicate, enduring harmony. The earth room, simple and humble, was one of the greatest tools in a hermit's winter arsenal. It taught him resilience, patience, and the kind of strength that doesn't shout but endures. It sheltered him from storms that could flatten entire forests. It offered him warmth when the world outside froze. It was his home, his refuge, and the quiet heart of his solitary life. As the storm tightened its grip on the mountains and night dragged itself across the frozen valley, the hermits were left with only one true shield between themselves and the prowling cold: fire. Not the roaring hearth, fires of medieval castles, not the smoking bonfires of village feasts, but carefully managed, deliberately restrained flames, small, persistent, and designed to outsmart the blizzard rather than overpower it. To the untrained eye, these fires might have seemed weak, even inadequate. But for hermits, mastering the art of firecraft was a matter of survival, discipline, and spiritual practice woven into a single skill. Most medieval hermits lived in stone cells built into the sides of cliffs, forest clearings, or abandoned watch houses. These were not insulated the way modern structures are. The walls were cold, the drafts constant, and the world outside their tiny doorways could shift from merely uncomfortable to deadly in a matter of hours. That meant every spark had to count. Every ember needed to serve a purpose. And every fire, no matter how small, needed to be managed in a way that provided warmth through the long, merciless nights while preserving precious fuel. Fuel itself was a treasure. Hermits often gathered driftwood from streams, fallen limbs from ancient trees, or small bundles of brush that grew on the rougher slopes. The wood was rarely perfect, often damp, sometimes half-rotted, frequently dense with resin or so old it splintered at the slightest touch. Yet hermits learned to read wood the way a monk reads scripture. They knew which branches burned quick and hot, which burned slow, which produced more smoke than heat, and which, when layered carefully, created a fire that would last until dawn. Before lighting anything, a hermit would inspect the stack of gathered fuel with deliberate patience. Fatwood res, enriched pine, was valuable for catching flame easily. Birch bark was another prize, peeling off like sheets of paper soaked in natural oil. But these were luxuries. More often, hermits relied on thin twigs and dried stems, building small, intricate structures inside their fire pits. A common method was the tepia style, with a tiny core of kindling encircled by thicker sticks angled upward. But hermits frequently deviated from this traditional shape. They built low, tight nests of wood instead, structures that trapped heat close to the ground. These nests were less dramatic but far more efficient during a blizzard, when wind could snake through cracks in stone walls and extinguish a flame before it had time to warm the air. Lighting the fire was itself a skill worth teaching. Unlike wealthy households that kept burning coals in metal pans, hermits usually had to start from scratch. They used flint and steel, striking again and again until sparks landed in a nest of dried moss or scraped fibers. The process could take minutes or hours depending on weather, and in winter storms, every gust of wind made the effort feel like trying to light a candle inside a waterfall. But hermits didn't rush. They breathed slowly, cupping their hands around the tinder, shielding it with their cloak, nursing each ember as though it were a living thing. Once a spark caught, they would bow down and blow gently, coaxing the ember into a glow, then a smolder, then finally a flame. When the fire came to life, it was never wasted on brightness. Hermits kept flames low, feeding them with small sticks until the fire created enough embers to sustain itself. Embers were the real key. A bed of glowing red coals radiated far more stable heat than tall flames and consumed much less fuel. Many hermits became masters at creating a perfect ember bed, stirring it gently with an iron poker or even a carved wooden stick, arranging it like an artist adjusts the strokes of a painting. Once the fire reached that ideal stage, bright without flaring, steady without sputtering, the hermit would place thicker logs or chunks of wood around the edges. These would slowly dry and heat up, then catch fire hours later, feeding the ember bed throughout the night. But a fire alone wasn't enough. Stone walls absorbed heat like a sponge absorbs water. A small fire in an uninsulated cell could warm only a tiny area. That meant the hermit had to sit close, very close. Often they built fire pits at ground level, no higher than a few inches, so the heat spread outward rather than upward into the cold air. Some hermits slept sitting upright beside these pits, with their cloak wrapped around them like a cocoon. Others lay down on the opposite side of the fire, letting the radiant heat warm their back, while layers of fur or rough, woven wool insulated their front. Yet even with skilled fire, building, warmth was not guaranteed. Blizzards were relentless. They blew through cracks in the walls, roared down chimneys, and sent smoke spiraling into the hermit's eyes. Some hermits built windbreaks inside their own cells, small stone barriers placed strategically around the fire pit to redirect drafts. Others hung animal hides over gaps in the walls, hammered into place using wooden pegs. Every improvement was small, but every improvement mattered. Fire also served a psychological purpose. In the solitude of winter nights, when the storm howled like a living creature and the darkness stretched endlessly, the fire became a companion. The soft crackling of wood, the faint glow that danced along the walls, the subtle warmth that spread across the hands, all of it reminded the hermit that life persisted even in the harshest cold. Many hermits wrote in their journals that fire represented a kind of earthly grace, a visible metaphor for divine presence. In the silence of the mountains, the fire whispered that the world had not abandoned them. Still, practical challenges were constant. Smoke was one of them. Without proper airflow, a fire could choke a hermit's cell with thick, acrid fumes. Many medieval hermits solved this by building fires directly below a small hole in the roof, sometimes a deliberate chimney, sometimes just a gap where a stone had fallen away. The hole allowed smoke to escape, but it also let icy wind in. The hermit had to balance ventilation with warmth, adjusting the fire's size or shifting its placement within the cell. Too little airflow and the hermit risked suffocation. Too much, and the fire weakened, sputtered, or blew out entirely. Hermits became remarkably good at creating microclimates inside their simple shelters. By combining fire with bedding of straw, moss, or rough wool, they trapped heat in specific areas. A hermit might place a warm stone near their sleeping spot, heated by the fire for hours, then wrapped in leather or cloth to prevent burns. This stone could radiate warmth well into the night. Others heated small clay pots filled with coals, using them like primitive space heaters. A clay vessel full of embers might be placed beneath a raised sleeping platform or beside the hermit's legs, offering warmth without the danger of open flame. Some hermits even mastered the art of using partially burned wood as a heat battery. They would remove a thick log from the fire once it had heated through, but before it had turned to coal. This glowing log, still solid, would continue to release heat slowly for hours when placed inside a clay pot or wrapped in a layer of ash. Ash itself was an insulator. Hermits often covered ember beds with it to keep them alive until morning. By dawn, the hermit could brush the ash aside, uncover glowing coals, and rebuild the fire with minimal effort. This technique was vital during blizzards when starting a new fire from flint might be almost impossible. Another clever strategy was the use of reflective surfaces. Though few hermits possessed polished metal, many used wood or stone slabs set behind the fire to bounce heat toward themselves. A large flat stone placed carefully could reflect radiant warmth, making a small fire feel more powerful. The reflective surface didn't need to be shiny, just flat enough to redirect thermal energy. Combined with a well-positioned sleeping area, it transformed the cell into a surprisingly warm micro-environment. Despite all these techniques, the danger of freezing or smoke inhalation was never far away. Hermits respected fire the way sailors respect the sea, aware of its power, grateful for its gifts, and cautious of its unpredictability. One wrong move or poorly placed log could create too much smoke, weaken the fire, or even cause a collapse of the embers. A fire that burned too quickly would consume fuel before dawn, leaving the hermit to shiver through the coldest hours of the night. A fire built too small would offer barely any relief. Every night was a new challenge, and every storm demanded adjustments. The hermits who lived in the higher mountains where the air was thinner and temperatures brutally cold, sometimes resorted to digging fire pits into the ground. These earth fireplaces were deeper, sheltered from wind, and capable of holding larger ember beds. Some disappeared into narrow trenches, with the hermit sitting above them like someone warming themselves over a vent. The earth pit method was common in rocky areas where gathering enough wood was difficult. A deep fire pit burned slowly, consuming fuel at a controlled rate. It was also safer, since embers were less likely to roll out onto the floor or ignite the hermit's bedding. In some regions, hermits mixed firecraft with remnants of ancient traditions. They heated stones until they glowed, then placed them inside piles of dry moss or under layers of animal skins. These stones held heat for astonishingly long periods and acted like primitive hot water bottles. Manuscripts from the Middle Ages mention hermits using dragon stones, a poetic name possibly referring to certain volcanic rocks that retained heat particularly well. Whether or not those exact stones existed, the practice itself was real. Fire-heated stones were a powerful tool for surviving cold nights, silent, steady, and needing no fuel once charged with heat. During blizzards, when wind rattled the wooden door and snow piled high against the outside walls, hermits treated their fire like a sacred ritual. They knelt by the hearth, tending it with slow, deliberate movements. The fire offered not only warmth, but also a sense of rhythm. Each log placed, each ember stirred, each wisp of smoke rising into the air gave structure to the long hours of isolation. The fire became a measure of time itself. Hermits often described watching the flames as a form of meditation. In the flickering light, their thoughts softened. The chaos of the storm outside seemed distant, almost unreal. The cell became a small island of stability in an ocean of winter. The relationship between hermits and fire was intimate. They knew the smell of every type of wood, felt the difference between embers ready to crumble and those still strong enough to ignite new fuel. They understood the subtle language of crackles and hissings, the wet logs that popped, the dry branches that curled inward, the soft glowing sounds that meant the fire was settling into its ember phase. This knowledge wasn't academic. It was lived experience, acquired through countless nights spent listening and observing. Over time, the hermit learned to wake at precise moments in the night. A slight drop in temperature, barely noticeable to most people, was enough to pull them from sleep. They would rise, add a small stick or two to the fire, adjust their bedding, and return to rest. This cycle, wake, tend, sleep, wake again, became part of their winter rhythm. Though exhausting, it kept them alive. Many hermits believed this nighttime vigilance was spiritually beneficial. It prevented deep, dreamless sleep and encouraged periods of contemplation, even in the darkest hours of the night. During especially severe blizzards, some hermits turned their fire pits into communal areas. Though hermits lived alone, there were occasions when 2 or 3 might shelter together for survival, especially if one fell ill or if the conditions outside became too dangerous. 2 or 3 bodies sharing heat around a single fire could survive temperatures that might kill someone alone. These rare moments of companionship were often described in journals as deeply meaningful. The crackling fire became a center of shared humanity, a simple flame bridging the loneliness of their chosen solitary life. In the end, fire was more than a tool for warmth. It was a symbol of persistence, a quiet defiance against the blizzard's fury, a small, stubborn reminder that even in isolation, even in a tiny stone cell battered by wind and snow, life would continue. The medieval hermit did not rely on comfort, abundance, or modern convenience. They relied on skill, patience, and the belief that a well-tended flame could carry them through the longest and harshest nights. And so, through each storm, the hermit hunched near their ember bed, cloak drawn tight, breath misting in the cold air. The fire glowed softly, its warmth radiating outward in a small circle of survival. Outside, the blizzard raged on, but inside the narrow stone cell, the hermit endured, shielded by knowledge, discipline, and a fire that never slept, even when they did. The deeper winter storms grew, the more the hermits relied on the natural materials around them: straw, moss, wool, bark, reeds, furs, and hides, to build a barrier between themselves and the creeping cold that seeped into their cells like a living fog. Fire alone couldn't warm the entire space, and even the most carefully tended ember bed had limits. The cold in a hermit's cell wasn't just air temperature. It was a physical presence that crept along the stone floor, climbed the walls, and pressed in during the night. To survive that kind of cold, hermits had to insulate themselves with anything the landscape provided, transforming crude materials into layers of warmth. Most hermits slept on platforms raised off the ground, simple wooden frames or stone slabs covered with straw. But a platform alone wouldn't keep them warm. Stone held cold the way cloth holds water, and wood could become icy overnight. That meant layers were essential. A typical hermit would start with a thick base of straw spread across the sleeping area. The straw wasn't soft like a mattress, but it provided crucial insulation, trapping pockets of warm air and preventing cold from traveling upward into the body. Hermits were experts at maintaining this straw layer, turning it, replacing moldy patches, fluffing it to keep it airy, and adding new handfuls whenever it compressed. But straw by itself was only the foundation. On top of it came moss, thick mats of it gathered from forest floors and rocky hillsides, cleaned of insects and dried in the sun during warmer months. Moss was invaluable because of its density and structure. It didn't compress easily, and when laid in wide, thick sheets, it absorbed moisture while adding another insulating layer. Hermits often sewed or tied moss into large mats, using thin strips of bark or twine made from plant fibers. These mats acted almost like ancient sleeping pads, natural, warm, surprisingly resilient. Some hermits layered moss beneath wool blankets, while others used it as a top layer that they could mold around themselves like a nest. Wool was rare for many hermits, since most lived in poverty and relied on donated scraps from villagers or monasteries, but even a small woolen blanket, it was a treasure. Wool remained warm even when damp, a life-saving feature during blizzards when moisture hung in the air and frost formed on stone walls. Hermits treated their wool blankets with animal fat or wax to make them more water-resistant. They rubbed these substances into the fibers by hand, letting the warmth of their palms melt the fat so it soaked deeper. Over time, the blanket became more like a heavy, flexible hide, dense, insulated, and capable of retaining heat. A well-treated wool blanket could last years, maybe even decades, and was considered one of a hermit's greatest possessions. Another important layer came from animal hides. Deer, goats, sheep, and sometimes even small animals like rabbits provided skins that hermits cleaned, dried, and stretched over frames. Each hide added a new kind of insulation. Fur traps warmth close to the body, and the leather underneath blocks wind. This combination made hides incredibly valuable. Hermits used them as blankets, mattress covers, wall coverings, door curtains, and even clothing. If a hermit had multiple hides, he might drape several across his sleeping platform, creating a soft, warm alcove. The fur side faced inward, hugging the body, while the leather side faced outward to block drafts. The coldest nights demanded more than simple layering. Hermits often built sleeping nests, deep pits or alcoves filled with materials arranged in a strategic pattern. At the base was straw, then moss, then a layer of wool or woven fibers, then hides arranged like roofing tiles to trap warmth. Finally, the hermit would wrap himself in a heavy cloak, often made of coarse wool, and curl into the nest with his back facing the fire. This method allowed the heat from the flames to warm the hides from behind while the insulating layers prevented heat from escaping. A well-built nest could hold warmth for hours, making the difference between a tolerable night and a deadly one. Sometimes hermits used techniques borrowed from old forest dwelling traditions. One such practice involved stuffing their clothing with extra material, straw, wool fibers, or dried leaves. It wasn't comfortable, and it made movement awkward, but it trapped body heat remarkably well. Medieval travelers used similar methods in harsh winters, and hermits adapted the technique for long nights alone. They layered tunics, cloaks, and furs until they resembled padded armor. Even the smallest gap between layers could become a reservoir of warmth. A unique insulation method came from barks, specifically birch bark, which could be peeled in wide, flexible strips without killing the tree. Birch bark repelled water and stayed surprisingly warm because of its multiple layers. Hermits often wove bark strips into mats or laid them beneath their bedding to prevent moisture from rising from the ground. In some regions, hermits created partial bark walls around their sleeping platforms to shield themselves from drafts. These bark walls functioned like a primitive windbreaker, redirecting cold air so it flowed around the sleeping area rather than through it. Moss and bark also played a role in sealing the hermit's cell. Cracks in the stone walls or gaps around the door could turn a warm shelter into an icebox. Hermits stuffed these openings with moss, bark, straw, or even packed snow. Snow, while cold, acted like an insulator once tightly packed. It blocked wind and stabilized interior temperatures. Filling cracks with snow was counterintuitive to outsiders, but to hermits it was an essential winter tactic. Once the packed snow froze solid, it acted like a stone, dense, windproof, and surprisingly effective. Inside the cell, hermits also built drapes or curtains from coarse cloth or hides. A large hide hung over the doorway kept warm air inside and blocked snow from blowing in. Some hermits added a second and even third curtain made of lighter cloth, creating air pockets that trapped warmth. This multi-layered doorway acted like a primitive vestibule. Even when the door was opened briefly, the curtains prevented most of the interior heat from escaping. Along the walls, hermits hung whatever insulating materials they could find. Old cloaks, spare hides, woven mats, and even bundles of dried reeds tied together. All of it went onto the walls in winter. Stone walls absorb heat relentlessly, pulling warmth away from the air and turning it into cold surfaces that radiate chill back into the room. Covering the walls created a barrier that slowed heat loss. In extreme blizzards, the entire cell might be lined with hides and mats, making the interior feel almost like the inside of a tent rather than a stone structure. Some hermits went further, smearing mud mixed with straw into cracks or applying clay coatings to the walls. Clay, when dried, hardened into a breathable shell that blocked drafts. This was essentially a primitive form of insulation, similar to the daub used in wattle and daub houses. Hermits without access to hides or wool often relied heavily on clay and moss to winter-proof their shelters. Another clever method involved hollow reeds or bundles of dried grasses. When tied tightly and layered together, these materials formed mats that acted like insulation boards. They trapped air between the fibers and slowed the escape of heat. Hermits wove these mats by hand, sometimes spending hours preparing just one section. It was tedious work, but essential during winter. A single woven mat could last several seasons, though moisture eventually wore it down. Even the hermit's cloak played a major insulating role. Most cloaks were made of heavy wool, often dyed a dull brown or gray, and they reached down to the feet. Hermits slept with their cloaks tightly wrapped around them, sometimes pulling the hood over their face to warm the air they breathed. This created a tiny microclimate, humid, insulated, and far warmer than the outside air. In many accounts, the hermit's cloak was described almost as a companion, something that traveled with them, sheltered them, absorbed their warmth, and preserved it. Over time, hermits learned how to balance insulation with breathability. Too much ceiling made the air inside stagnant, smoky, or damp. Too little allowed cold drafts to creep in. The goal was not to make the cell warm. It never became warm in the way modern homes do, but to make it survivable. Warm enough that the hermit's core body temperature stayed stable. Warm enough that frost didn't form on their bedding. Warm enough that sleep was possible. Hermits also adapted their sleeping positions to reduce heat loss. Curling tightly was the most common posture, knees drawn toward the chest, arms tucked close, head lowered. This position minimized exposed surface area and trapped heat near the vital organs. Some hermits slept sitting upright, back against the wall, cloak wrapped tightly. This allowed them to stay near the fire and adjust it when necessary. Others curled beside heated stones or clay pots filled with coals, letting the radiant heat warm their bodies slowly throughout the night. On especially brutal nights, hermits buried themselves deeper into their bedding. They would crawl into the nest until only the top of their head remained exposed, breathing warm air inside the tunnel they had created. Their breath helped warm the space, and the layers of moss, straw, wool, and fur held that heat like a natural furnace. Preparing these layers wasn't just a winter task it took all year. In spring, hermits gathered fresh moss and spread it out to dry. In summer, they collected reeds, bark, wool scraps, and straw. In autumn, they cleaned and repaired bedding, checking every stitch and tie. A hermit who neglected these preparations rarely survived harsh winters. In their solitude, with no one to rescue them, preparation was a matter of life or death. The spiritual significance of bedding and insulation wasn't lost on medieval hermits. They often wrote that the layers surrounding them felt like a metaphor for divine protection. Thin, simple materials shielding them from forces more powerful than themselves. Some described the process of building their nest as an act of humility, using what creation offered, accepting their vulnerability, and acknowledging that survival wasn't guaranteed, but was still worth striving for. Despite the simplicity of their materials, hermits approached insulation with surprising sophistication. They understood heat transfer intuitively, how warm air rises, how cold air settles, how moisture steals warmth, how layered fibers trap pockets of air. They had no scientific vocabulary for these concepts, yet their instincts and lived experience kept them alive. What they built with straw and moss rivaled in effectiveness the furs used by nomads in the Arctic or the layered textiles of medieval travelers crossing snowy mountains. Throughout the long winter, insulation became their constant companion. It was the silent partner to fire, the counterpart to all their efforts to manage embers and flames. When the fire dipped or the wind shifted, the hermit's bedding kept the worst of the cold at bay. When the blizzard roared outside like a living beast, the layers wrapped around the herm, its body softened the blow. Fire warmed them directly, but insulation preserved that warmth, holding onto it like cupped hands around a candle. Night after night, through storms that blotted out stars and turned the world to swirling white, the hermit curled inside their nest, cloak wrapped tight, furs piled high. The cold pressed against the cell, but the hermit endured, shielded not by luxury or abundance, but by simple materials gathered with patience and shaped with wisdom. Survival wasn't glamorous. It wasn't dramatic. It was quiet, methodical, and deeply human. 1,000 tiny decisions, each one adding a little more warmth, a little more protection, a little more life to the fragile space between the hermit and the cold. And in that fragile space, night after night, the hermit slept, secure beneath layers of straw, moss, wool, and fur, while the blizzard outside raged on without mercy. As the blizzard tightened its grip on the mountains, there came a point where even the best prepared hermit faced an unavoidable truth. Warmth could no longer be taken from fire, clothing, or bedding alone. There were nights, especially the deep winter nights when temperatures plunged so sharply that even the air seemed to break, when the hermit had to fall back on a much more intimate source of warmth. Their own breath, their own posture, the heat of their own body carefully preserved and rotated like the embers of a dying fire. In those moments, survival depended on the herm, its ability to understand how the human body loses heat, how to reposition themselves to conserve energy, and how to create a pocket of livable space in a cell that felt like the inside of a frozen cave. Body heat, fragile as it was, became the final line of defense. A herm, it could survive without food for days, even weeks. But let the body temperature drop too far, and death could come quietly, almost gently, in the middle of the night. The cold doesn't always strike with violence. Sometimes it slips in like a whisper, numbing the fingers, slowing the breathing, fogging the mind, and lulling its victim into a sleep from which they cannot wake. Medieval hermits knew this by experience and instinct. They had watched neighbors perish in winter, heard stories of travelers frozen in place as they rested momentarily on a hillside, their cloaks pulled tight around them. This awareness taught hermits to treat their own body heat like a treasured resource, one that needed to be carefully guarded and strategically used. The first technique was simple posture. Hermits rarely slept stretched out during blizzards. A fully extended body loses heat rapidly through exposed limbs and surfaces. Instead, they curled themselves as tightly as possible, folding arms across chest, bending knees toward the stomach, tucking their chin down. This posture reduced the surface area exposed to cold and kept warmth clustered around the vital organs. Some hermits wrapped their cloaks so tightly in this curled position that it almost resembled a cocoon, with multiple layers crossing over the chest like wrappings. Inside this cocoon, their breath warmed the small cavity near their face, turning it into a tiny microclimate, humid, warmer, and easier to inhale. Breathing, too, had to be controlled. In extreme cold, every exhalation carries precious heat away. Hermits instinctively cupped their hands before their mouth or pulled their cloak over their face so that each breath cycled through the same pocket of warm air. The cloak grew damp, but wool and fur held warmth even when wet, and the humidity helped prevent frost from forming around their nose. To someone observing from the outside, a hermit preparing for sleep during a blizzard might appear almost buried inside their own garments, with only the faint rise and fall of their shoulders indicating life. But posture alone was not enough, especially during long nights when the cold grew more intense as the hours passed. Hermits developed routines to warm different parts of the body in sequence. They rubbed their hands vigorously to increase circulation, then tucked them under their armpits or between their thighs, areas rich with heat, producing blood flow. They pressed their feet together or against the warm side of their calves, using the largest muscles of the body to maintain temperature. When their fingers went numb, they clenched and unclenched them repeatedly, forcing blood back into the extremities. Some hermits developed a rhythm of shifting slightly throughout the night, rotating the parts of their body exposed to the fire or the warm bedding. If their back grew cold, they turned carefully to warm it while keeping the rest of their body covered. These movements were practiced with extreme efficiency, quick, quiet, and deliberate, to avoid letting cold air slip inside the layers of insulation. Then there was the technique known in various traditions as breath warming, a slow, controlled breathing pattern that reduces heat loss from the lungs while steadying the heartbeat. Hermits inhaled through their nose, slowly and deeply, then exhaled through slightly parted lips or directly into the folds of their cloak. The breath accumulated in the insulation, trapped just long enough to create a small envelope of warmth. Over the course of several minutes, this gentle warming effect spread through the layers around the herm, its chest and face, not enough to heat the entire body. Nothing but a roaring fire could do that, but enough to ease the bite of the air inside their cell. Some hermits practiced more advanced forms of breath control, often learned from long periods of silence and meditation. They discovered that by regulating their breath, they could also regulate their perception of cold. They could slow their breathing to conserve energy, calm their mind to avoid panic, and focus on the rhythm of heat flowing outward from their core. While not magical, this technique aligned with the body's natural stress responses and allowed hermits to stay awake longer or remain calm even as temperatures fell around them. Another strategy was physical contact with heated objects. Hermits often placed warm stones or clay pots filled with embers near their legs or lower back. These heated objects didn't need to be burning hot, just warm enough to radiate heat gradually across a small area of the body. The hermit curled around them, letting their own body heat mingle with the residual warmth of the stones. In some cases, they wrapped a heated stone inside their cloak, pressing it against their chest like a primitive hot water bottle. The stone's warmth faded slowly through the night, but the combined heat from both stone and body was often enough to keep cold at bay. Hermits without access to clay vessels or smooth stones sometimes turned to warm ash. They scooped handfuls of cooled ash, warm but not burning, and sealed them inside pouches made of cloth or hide. These ash-filled pouches acted like flexible heating pads that the hermit could place against areas of the body most vulnerable to cold. The ash retained warmth for longer than wood and provided a surprisingly stable source of heat, especially when kept under layers of insulation. Throughout the night, hermits listened closely to their own bodies. A drop in core temperature was noticeable long before the danger became severe. They felt it in the slowing of their heartbeat, the stiffness of their fingers, the heaviness of their eyelids, or the dull ache in their neck and spine. When these signs appeared, the hermit forced themselves to sit up, stretch their hands, reposition their cloak, or add another small stick to the fire. It took discipline, especially when fatigue made every movement feel heavy, but the hermit knew that ignoring the warning signs could be fatal. On the coldest nights, when the blizzard outside roared like a living creature trying to claw its way into the cell, the hermit sometimes paced slowly around the tiny interior. Even a few steps increased circulation, sending warm blood to their extremities. They kept their cloak tight around them, head lowered, hands clasped inside the fabric. The pacing created a different rhythm from sleep, one that broke the monotony of the storm and reminded the hermit that their body was still capable of generating heat through motion. Other hermits adopted the practice of tightening their clothing strategically. A cloak or tunic left too loose created gaps where heat escaped. Tightening belts, fastening cords, and tucking fabric into itself helped seal the body's warmth inside. But excessive tightness was dangerous too. It could restrict circulation and cause limbs to grow cold faster. The hermit had to strike a delicate balance, snug enough to trap heat, loose enough to allow blood to flow freely. Experience taught them where the sweet spot was. Some hermits used an even more unusual technique, creating a body tent. They built a small enclosure around themselves using layered hides or woven mats supported by simple wooden sticks. Inside this enclosure, their body heat warmed the confined air more efficiently, creating a micro-environment within the cell. This body tent took only minutes to assemble but could make a severe night survivable. Warmer air rose into the small dome, and the hermit breathed this air back in with each breath, maintaining a slightly elevated temperature around their body. The fire didn't need to be large. just enough to keep the enclosure from becoming too damp or the air too thin. For hermits living near forests, pine boughs and evergreen branches played a crucial role in insulating body heat. Fresh pine needles, when layered thickly, created soft piles that trapped warmth remarkably well. Hermits sometimes lay between two layers of pine boughs, the bottom layer insulating them from the cold surface beneath, the top layer acting like a weighted blanket. The scent of pine also deterred some insects, though in deep winter this mattered less. What mattered was the insulating structure of the needles, which kept warm air trapped close to the body. A hermit's clothing itself became a system for preserving body heat. The first layer was usually a rough linen tunic worn directly against the skin. Linen wicks moisture away, keeping the skin dry, a crucial detail in winter since moisture steals heat rapidly. Over this tunic came a woolen layer, thick and coarse, often mended dozens of times. Over the wool, the hermit wrapped a fur-lined cloak or hooded mantle. The hood was essential. Much of the body's heat escapes from the head, and hermits kept theirs tightly covered, especially at night. When the storm was especially cruel, some hermits slept with their knees drawn up beneath their cloak, their hands and feet pressed together, all limbs tucked inward around the core of the body. This posture, though cramped, helped preserve warmth and slowed the progression of numbness in the extremities. If the hermit needed to warm their feet, they sometimes placed them under their cloak near their stomach or pressed them against their thighs, muscle-rich areas that generated heat easily. There was also a psychological component to preserving body heat. Fear and panic drain energy quickly. A mind filled with dread makes the body tense, burning calories and raising the heart rate, only to crash later into a state of exhaustion. Hermits learned early on that calmness was essential. Many of them entered a meditative state during blizzards, focusing their thoughts on prayer, contemplation, or simple rhythmic repetition. This mental discipline kept them from hyperventilating, helped slow their breathing, and allowed their bodies to settle into a stable rhythm that minimized heat loss. The silence of the blizzard inside the hermit's cell sometimes pressed against their thoughts like a heavy weight. But instead of resisting it, hermits leaned into the silence, letting it become part of their experience rather than something to fight. They quieted their minds, breathed steadily, and accepted their vulnerability without surrendering to it. This combination of mental calm and physical conservation helped them survive nights that would have overwhelmed less prepared individuals. Hermits also understood the importance of conserving energy. They avoided unnecessary movements that wasted heat, refrained from tasks that made their bodies sweat, and rationed their exertion carefully. Sweat was especially dangerous in winter. Even small amounts of moisture soaked into wool or linen could cause severe chilling once the body cooled. Hermits avoided sweating at all costs, even in moments of manual labor. When they had to chop wood, clear snow, or gather water, they worked slowly and took breaks to avoid overheating. During long blizzards, the hermit's cell often became a closed system. No fresh air entered except through narrow cracks or the small chimney hole. In such conditions, body heat became one of the main contributors to keeping the temperature inside slightly higher than outside. Even a difference of a few degrees could mean survival. The hermit moved only when absolutely necessary, preserving this precious warmth. Over the years, hermits developed an intimate awareness of their body's heat distribution. They knew where they felt cold first, fingers, toes, ears, and took steps to protect these vulnerable points. They wrapped their hands in cloth even when inside the cell. They covered their feet with doubled layers of wool or fur. They pulled their cloak tight around their ears and cheeks, knowing that frost could bite quickly and without warning. In extremely harsh storms, hermits sometimes slept in shifts, not because they had multiple people, but because their own body needed periodic warming. They remained awake for part of the night, tending the fire, rubbing their limbs, moving slightly, and then allowed themselves short periods of rest. This prevented their core temperature from dropping too low during deep sleep. The blizzard outside continued its relentless assault, wind screaming, snow piling against the hermit's door. But inside the cell, the hermit endured, not through strength or force, but through careful preservation of the only warmth that remained guaranteed, their own. And so, in the darkest hours of winter, when even the fire burned low and the stone walls shivered with cold, the hermit curled into the smallest possible shape, breath warming the fabric before their face, limbs pulled close, heart beating steadily beneath layers of wool and fur. Their body heat, fragile but persistent, held them through the night while the blizzard raged on beyond the thin walls of their solitary refuge. When a hermit faced the long winter night, with its crushing darkness and the roar of a blizzard that swallowed the world outside, the experience was never simply about staying physically warm. It was a test of mind, body, and spirit. Medieval hermits lived at the edge of human endurance, not only because of isolation and poverty, but because they embraced a lifestyle that demanded an unshakable connection to discipline. Their nights were not spent in comfort, and certainly not in ease. They learned to adapt every movement, every breath, every moment of wakefulness or sleep to a rhythm that preserved their life. Silence was not only their spiritual practice, it was a survival strategy, a way to preserve heat, strength, and awareness in an environment where even one mistake could cost everything. Imagine a hermit living somewhere deep within a forest, far away from any village, in a shelter carved into the slope of a rocky hill. Snow has been falling without pause for 12 hours, piling up against the entrance of the small earth chamber. Inside, the heat